first of all, it'd be really great if you would just pop in the chat, what does organisational culture mean to you? So it's a big question, isn't it? But if you can put perhaps 1 or 2 words that you think sum up organisational culture. There's obviously lots of different definitions around what culture is and what it means, and we'll explore some of that today. But it'd be brilliant just to see what your thoughts are. If you described it in a couple of words, what would it be? So we've got the way that we do things around here. I think that's definitely something that resonates with people, isn't it? What's happening? How do we do things? How do we work? And you hear a lot of organisations that talk about their way of doing things and what that means. We've got values and behaviours that people subscribe to. And there's a real difference, isn't there, between the values and behaviours that are perhaps written on the wall and what actually happens in practice. Hopefully that those two are aligned. But if culture isn't so great, it tends to be the opposite, actually. Behaviours towards each other, expectations, how we address issues and communicate.
No, I've had a feeling, so
can everyone just make sure they're on mute?
It's Gosford, so I can be there in about 20 minutes.
We've also got what you see and accept, and I think that's a really important one, isn't it? Because actually what you see in terms of that culture, what you behaviour that you choose to walk past is what you expect and what you accept in terms of that culture. So I think that's a really, really important one. Definitely unwritten rules. I think the unwritten rules about how we operate is something that's really key, and something that you can't always see and put your finger on.
Thanks, Gillian. Bye-bye.
I think we've got somebody who's just not on mute. We can hear your telephone conversation. So if you're not on mute, just pop yourself on mute if that's okay. But that's brilliant. So thanks for sharing some of that. I think that's really important just to get an understanding of what we think organisational culture means to us.
Yeah, I think what's really interesting about that as well is the fact that it's very much about unwritten rules. And that's what's making this so tricky to kind of really approach, like moving towards a positive culture. So what we'd like you to do is just assess where your culture currently is in your organisation. This is anonymous, so you can be as honest as you like. So we're going to launch a poll. It should pop up on your screen. If you just tick where you think you are right now, it's just for fun. I know those definitions are not particularly serious, but we just wanted to gauge where everybody's up to right now. So where do you think you are right now? Please be reassured, it is anonymous. There's no way of tracing who said what if you really wish you worked somewhere else. Okay, hopefully, I can't see how many people have voted, Jo, so I'm hoping
66. So we're there. Yeah.
Brilliant. So if you could just share those.
Right, I will end the poll now, then you should be able to see the results, I think.
Perfect. Oh, so we've got you very much in the middle there, sort of 44% of people, but putting it as a nice safe 3, because there's probably things I imagine that are working really well for you, but there's probably lots of improvements that can be made as well. I love that 3% of you actually love where you're working. It's so refreshing to see that, there's hope and there's light at the end of the tunnel, that it can be literally a place where people thrive. And obviously we've got a couple of people that, well, 2% of you wish you worked somewhere else, and that's sad, isn't it? So obviously think about, when we're going through this session, we can't change your culture in an hour, but what we can do is just give you some food for thought around where to start, what's really important to consider. So we'll just I'll close that poll, and let's think about, obviously the big thing in most of our organisations, if not all, is the CQC and what that actually asks us to look at. When I was in the NHS, interestingly, I used to get really frustrated because every time the CQC used to come in, it was like it was a big surprise to everybody. And suddenly you'd be all running around the organisation trying to find data, trying to find things to prove that you're doing some of these things, and what CQC say is actually good. So one of the things I tried to do was set up all of our projects, all of our work around what CQC say is good practice. And if we build that language into our plans, it's going to support when they actually show up. So when we think about what CQC well-led looks like, when we think about inclusive, consider your recruitment processes. Are they consistent? We know we've worked with different trusts where some people need masters, some people don't, some people need experience, all for the same job. So actually, let's make that really inclusive. Are we making sure that people can access those opportunities as well? Who's accessing development opportunities, and who's getting promoted and who isn't? You know, are there some real barriers there for some groups within your organisation that just can't see anyone that looks like them or behaves like them at a senior level, and therefore that's a huge barrier. So how inclusive are your practices? Are staff getting the time investment to have one-to-ones, and more importantly, are they meaningful? And then obviously is there enough psychological safety to encourage staff to speak up and report risks? So it's a great starting point to think about what a CQC looking for when they arrive. And obviously we can go into a lot more detail on this, but we won't for the purpose of today. A lot of you mentioned earlier around what organizational culture looks like, and you're right, it is about those beliefs, it's about the behaviors, the values, the attitudes, how we do things around here, and because much of it is unwritten, it makes it very difficult to grasp. And actually what we value and what we believe can be two very different things. So if I asked you a question now, if you just raise your virtual hand if you all value your health. Okay, so if you value your health, and we all do, how many people have gone for a nice walk this morning or a run and foregone the coffee and not had any sugar this week and made sure they didn't drink any alcohol? And you don't have to answer that question, but actually, you know, when we think about values and beliefs, we all value something, but we believe that actually that's not going to affect us because my family are healthy, heart disease doesn't run in my family. So we all have different belief criteria that's different to our values. And that's why when we talk about shared values, attitudes, things like that, it's very, very difficult to grasp. It's difficult to define because it's different to everybody. So let's look at this from an organisational perspective. What are we dealing with? And these figures come from Gallup. If you've come across Gallup, they do the Strengths Finder. They do some great articles that you'll find really useful. And let's look at this in terms of engagement. So what does a typical organisation actually look like? Well, you have got a number of employees there, about 20%, who are really engaged. They're the people, if you think about your own teams for a second, they're the people that when you go on holiday, they act up, they step up, they deliver, they're high performers, they're enthusiastic, they're present, they're connected, they're all of those things rolled into one. So we've only typically got around 20%. If you have more than that, then well done, kudos to you. Typically in the middle there, we've got 65% not engaged. Now, this doesn't necessarily look like poor behaviour. This is just people who are showing up, doing the bare minimum, but they're not particularly engaged or connected. There's no energy or passion there, but they are doing the job, and they're sometimes more difficult to deal with. And then we've got around 15% who are actively not engaged at work. These people are resentful, they're perhaps acting out. We call them pirates, and pirates are negative people, or people with a negative attitude, should I say, but who do lots about it. So, you know, they might be drumming up a little bit of trouble in meetings, or, you know, and the thing is about pirates, and we'll talk more about pirates later, is they are still passionate about what they do. Absolutely, Cheryl, mood hoovers, I love that. Oh, just make sure you're on mute, Rosie. There we go, brilliant, thank you. So mood hoovers is another way, but I suppose mood hoovers could just walk into a room and suck everything dry, can't they? Whereas pirates are quite active about being not engaged. So how this looks, a better way of looking at this is this analogy here. So when we think about people on a boat, we've got two people at the front there who are actively rowing the boat. They're picking up an oar every day and they're heading towards your strategic goals, and they're making things happen. We've got 6 people in the middle there who are there doing the bare minimum and playing nice, paying a bit of lip service, but they're not picking up an oar. Okay, not all of the time anyway. And then at the back there, we've got the 2 pirates, the active boat sinkers. Our challenge with our culture is to enable, forget about the boat sinkers, because what we want to do is really kick them off, but we don't tend to do that in the NHS as much as we should. But actually, let's focus on those 6 in the middle there. What we need to do is get those people to pick up an oar more of the time. And when you think about your own teams, when you think about that split, just think of those individuals individually now, and think about who your rowers are, who your passengers are, and who the boat sinkers are, and just bear that in mind. And if you put your focus onto those 6 in the middle, it's going to be more effective than focusing on the pirates at the back, even though they still need dealing with. So actually, this is something we've got to bear in mind. But in order to do this, we really need to begin with the end in mind. And this is obviously, people will be familiar with Covey, 7 Habits of Highly Successful People. I absolutely love his work. I love the language in it. It's fantastic. But actually, most of us are very busy at work doing all the right things, but very few of us actually think, what's this all for? Why are we doing all of these things? What is it going to result in? So having that end in mind is really, really important. So when we think about our own cultures, it's important that we take part in some sort of visualization activity to understand why we're doing what we're doing. Otherwise, you've just got a list of projects on a sheet of paper that are all the right things to have. But in terms of communication, we don't know why we're doing it. So just for 1 second, for just a minute, you please do put this in chat if you feel that you want to share this, or just take a moment yourself. If you think about your own team, let's start small. Think about your own team. If the culture was where it needed to be, what do you see, hear, feel on a typical day? What's happening? How are people engaging with each other? What difference is it making? So a little bit of, not quite meditation, but visualization. What's going on in your own team when everything is where you want it to be? Oh, thanks, Susan. Yeah, that's brilliant that you shared that. Caring for each other, listening, working together, absolutely. Pride, teamwork, love these words. Nurturing, fantastic word. And a collective vision, so important. We're going to talk about that next. And laughter, absolutely, Cheryl. You always need laughter. If you're going to thrive at work, obviously you need to bring some bit of laughter in as well, humour. Fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing that. This is such an important activity to do, because otherwise we're just ticking things off a list. So always be clear on what the end goal actually is.
Yeah, brilliant. There's some lovely things in there about engagement and enjoy being challenged. I think that's important as well, because it is about harmony, but it's also about challenging things if they're not right as well, and actually having the right conditions that people feel comfortable with that in psychological safety, really. So yeah, I wanted to has anyone come across this before? I'm sure you will have done. Simon Sinek talks about start with why. We bring this into everything. If you've been on any of our sessions, we'll have probably mentioned it, because it's at the heart of everything, really, isn't it? Because we tend to, organisationally, if you think about the meetings that you go to, where do you spend your most of your time? Is it thinking about why we're doing what we're doing, or is it the what? And 9 times out of 10, it's usually what we're doing, what have we got on this week, what are some of the KPIs we're not meeting, what's this latest report saying in this committee meeting, very much in that what space. But what's really important is to come back to the why, to make sure that people are really connected to the purpose and the vision, but also thinking about if you're wanting to look at culture change. So for those of you that were perhaps scoring a little bit lower when we did the 1 to 5 poll, why are we doing it? Is it, you know, people don't want to hear that it's we've got to tick a box, but why? What's important about changing the culture? Why do you want to do that? Because, for example, if you started perhaps introducing, well, we need to get better at one-to-ones, we need to get better at appraisals. Okay, well, that's great, but why? What's the purpose behind that? And are people having those one-to-ones and appraisals in a way that's meaningful, rather than it just being, well, we've ticked that box and we've done it, and our staff engagement survey says that 90% of people are having appraisals, but what about the quality of that, and why is that important? So that's really important to obviously get your leaders on board with some of this as well. But you want everyone to know what the culture is that you're striving for. So all of those things that you've put in the chat there is about why. This is why we're wanting to do it, because this is what we want it to look like. How are we going to do it? Well, actually, what we're going to do is engage with people in a different way, enable people to have regular one-to-ones, because actually we want people to play to our strength, play to the strengths, feel that they can develop and grow, feel comfortable to raise any issues when they feel that there's room for improvement, go home feeling energized, contributing ideas to how things get done. So if you're selling it almost in a way that's actually, we want to make things better for you for these reasons, it's going to get people on board a little bit more. And at an organisational level, it might be things around, actually, we want less complaints, we want less grievances, we want absence management to be better and more focused on a well-being and a holistic approach. We want to create conditions where people can thrive, and how we do that is by supporting our managers to have better conversations. So they're all cultural outputs of the things that you choose to do, and visualising that success is a key component really of any culture change. And when it's done well, every time you look at things like your people plan or your strategy or even your own objectives, the things that you should do should really have that clear why behind them. I don't know if anyone's come across the story of Ben Hunt-Davies, who led the Great Britain rowing team to success in 2000. Britain never won gold before. And he's written a book. If anyone's seen him speak, he's really inspiring. There's some TED Talks that you can look at, but he's written a book called Will It Make the Boat Go Faster? And in it, he talks about their vision as a team wasn't to win gold, because actually they couldn't necessarily influence that. But what they did have influence over was making the boat go faster. So that became their ultimate purpose, the why that they were doing it. So, you know, should we go to the pub for lunch? Is it going to make the boat go faster? Probably not. Should we go and spend 8 hours on a rowing machine? Yes, because that is going to make the boat go faster. So really understanding what, almost coming back to your question, whether that's your team purpose or thinking about why you want to change the culture, or all the things that you're doing in terms of the how and the what centered around that question. If you can come up with that question, that's brilliant. And a lot of people have quite a strong vision or a sense of purpose for their team, but actually everything they're doing doesn't lead to that. You think about all the emails that we have to respond to now, all the meetings that you're in. If you ask yourself, is it making the boat go faster? Chances are some of those things aren't, so why are we doing them? And if you were to ask your colleagues if they wanted some of those outputs around people going home feeling more energized or having better conversations, the chances are they're going to say yes, but very few understand the link and impact of how what they do leads to those outcomes. So again, if you were thinking about the percentages in the boat that we talked about, if you were to put a percentage on how many people are in the boat with you towards the new culture or that change that you want to see, proactively working towards it, so not just people that say, yeah, that's great, but don't actually engage in behaviour. How many people would you say in your organisation are fully with you towards that new culture that you're striving for? And be brutally honest here, if you were to put a percentage on it, what would it be? You don't have to share this, it's just a bit of a rhetorical question. In a lot of organisations, you only inherently get around 10% of people who are readily on board and who want to change because they believe it's the right thing to do. They just get it. And there's a model, you've probably come up, some people will have come across this before, but the diffusion of innovation theory is one of the oldest social science theories. And it was developed by a professor named Everett Rogers, actually in 1962. And no matter what it is, there's always a bell curve, isn't there? But this one is around how people take up change. So the first 5% are your innovators, are your big thinkers, the people that are actually coming up with some brilliant ideas and different ways of doing things. Then you've got your early adopters who are quick to be on board with something that really aligns to their beliefs. You've got the early majority and the late majority. It sounds like a harsh name, but the last group is our laggards. So the people that really don't get on board till right at the end, and just wait and see what else is happening, probably dig their feet in a little bit until they have to change. But when it comes to culture change, the innovators are the ones that are driving that ship. We love a good boat analogy. So coming back to that boat, they're identifying which way we're heading and why. Our early adopters are likely to be our culture champions, and the early majority are those who agree it's a good idea but might not actually change their behaviour. The late majority tend to go along with it eventually if there's enough change and for long enough. And our laggards are the ones that perhaps work hard to keep the status quo. So they're going to be quite vocal about it. So coming back to your pirates again. And there might be very little behaviour change there. But culture change is how do we change the majority? So think about the boat analogy. How do you get those people in the middle to perhaps pick up an oar more of the time? This defines the cultural norm and how we do things around here in its broadest sense. But and it's a big but, the way to get this culture change is not to focus on the middle two groups at all. It sounds a little bit counterintuitive actually, but these are the people who need that what's in it for me to change. And it's a hard sell when you're talking about something like culture that they can't really visualize yet. They often don't want to try something until someone else has proven it works, until they see it's beneficial to them, whether for positive benefits or reduction in negative effects. Some ways that you can really recruit your early adopters. And it's thinking about, again, you'll be looking at the results of your staff survey and knowing what that looks like, but which parts of the organisation are scoring highly in your staff survey? Where are you witnessing great practice and innovative ideas? Because those are going to be people that actually you want to get on board quite early on. Who might be leading on quality improvement, for example, because that's going to have a big impact on your culture. Who's coming up with brilliant ideas? But also, who are your pirates? Because actually, like we said, they're the people that are quite vocal about change and want to get their views across and think about how we do things differently. And actually, we need to tap into their expertise, because what they've got that perhaps other groups haven't got is that they are being quite vocal about it. So they do actually, they're not happy with the status quo because they're moaning about it and they want to change. And it's almost how, so they've got some energy there. So how do you change that negative energy into real?
Sorry, I couldn't find my mute button then.
Oh, I had it ready because I was like, 10 o'clock's coming. So identifying your pirates is really, really helpful, because you might think that they're lurking at the back end of that model that we just described. So thinking about your laggards, but actually if you're having the right conversations with them, they can move up that model and start to be the people that you early adopters really. There's some good ways of doing this. So just to give you a bit of an example, really, we recently ran a hackathon. Has anyone done a hackathon? Tried a hackathon? Heard of a hackathon? It sounds like a really technical term, and it actually is, because it comes from the IT world when people were tasked with coming up with, I'm not very good at IT speak, but coming up with some new innovative stuff around an app or a new program, and almost getting IT people locked in a room together with a computer going, right, we're just going to make this happen today. This is what we're going to do. So that's why it was called a hackathon. But if you adapt that into the real world, just to give you an example, we ran something with a trust quite recently, who wanted to really think about again, they were looking at changing the culture. And one of the things that they'd identified was we need to get better at one-to-ones and appraisals and supervision as well. So they came up with the idea of let's run a hackathon. And what they did was they basically got people from right across the organisation together in a room. So they got people that you were pirates on board. So yeah, there were some trade union leaders in there, for example. They got people that were actually perhaps representative of underrepresented groups in that organisation. They got people who actually were in that innovative space as well. And you had a real mix of people from all different areas, got them together in a room, and almost we used appreciative inquiry to help them visualize actually if you were having the ideal one-to-one or appraisal conversation, what would that look like? And what would that be? And imagine you're having the best conversations you've ever had. What does that look like? And really went into that dream phase, but then encouraged as we worked throughout the day to go, okay, so how do we make that happen in practice? And by the end of the day, those groups had come up with a brand new way of recording appraisals. There was somebody from IT in there, so it's thinking about who are your key stakeholders you might want to get in, that made it so much easier for people. An actual appraisal form that blew the water out of the last one. It was a page long, maybe 2. It was so intuitive. Some people had been on a group writing a policy, so starting to write policy around this, what this would look like, thinking about that engagement plan, how do we get people on board with it, thinking about how they could make it happen and how they might record things. So it was just a way, because we go to that many meetings, don't we, or I used to in the NHS, where you're just talking about doing stuff, whereas a hackathon is just a brilliant way of getting together all of those people at different stages of the boat or the model together in a room, and then coming out with some really great outputs at the end. Obviously there was work to do after that to refine it and then go back and engage with people, but actually just getting stuff done in a day is a way of getting people on board with it. Plus they're going to go and talk to people in their teams about what's happened as well. So just one idea, there's many ideas. And if anyone has got some brilliant ideas how they've got your sort of early adopters on board, or even your laggards, please do pop it in the chat, because I think it's great that we can learn from each other around that as well. But I think the key thing is just to realise that it's not another internal comms campaign. And Simon Sinek talks about this again quite a lot. But when we're talking about culture change, we often see the big marketing campaign, you know, how do we target the masses? But when we're talking about behaviour change, as we've seen in that Rogers model, the spray and pray approach to culture change doesn't work. And it's one of the reasons why actually 70% of change initiatives fail.
And the reason for this, if we're going to just keep this really simple for a second, there are things that stop us doing the desired behaviours that we want to see, and there are things that help or facilitate us to achieve. And it's a little bit like an equation. Behaviour change equals facilitators minus the barriers. However, it gets tricky because not all barriers nor all facilitators are created equal. So what we can often get is a kind of missing piece of the puzzle. And you know, we're not seeing things. We don't do the diagnostics enough to see things from all angles and all perspectives, because quite often we're in a rush, we have deadlines and we have to get things done, and we have to get things done by the end of March, for example. So these kind of parameters really do act as a barrier sometimes. And we do need to get the right environment where we see that behaviour change. And in the context of behaviour, just to give you an example, imagine you're in a car now and you're in the driver's seat, and you know, it's a nice day or a rainy day or a snowy day for some of you apparently, you know, somebody pulls out from the side of the road and cuts you up. The first thought, please don't put this in chat because we don't want any swear words live, but first thought is obviously, you know, what an idiot, what an awful driver. We throw labels at people, but we don't know why they're behaving in that way or why they've done what they've done. So maybe, you know, they're in a rush to get home, or they're on the way to a family member in need and they've just been a little bit careless. So, and this is a problem we've got all the time. It's a little bit like catchphrase, where you only get part of the picture revealed. So we make assumptions. We don't have that full picture to understand what's driving the behaviour. So we have to jump to conclusions. And then we build culture change interventions on assumptions. And guess what? They don't work out. And this can be very frustrating. So there's no holiday for 4 for prizes for accurately getting the culture problem right. Arguably, the prize is far greater if we do get it right. So just think back, have you ever jumped to conclusions when somebody comes to you and they want to address something in their team, and they want team building? How many of us go straight into that team building without really doing the proper diagnostic exercise that understands what else is going on? Because we can do intervention after intervention and still nothing changes. So it's so important that we use diagnostics to make better decisions about what actually might be needed. You know, if anyone's seen the videos of cats being scared by cucumbers, bit of a random link here, but obviously the cats are jumping to conclusions that the cucumber is a snake because snakes are dangerous and the cat should be scared of those snakes. But obviously, when we're making assumptions at work and we just jump into the same conclusions all the time, this can be a real barrier. So we really do need to think about what is the full picture. Don't go in head first or feet first when we've only got part of the picture. Wait till you get the full picture. And the only way to do that is to start thinking about diagnosis. Okay, so what is the diagnosis issue that we have? Now, there are absolutely challenges to this, because the reality is that the diagnostic phase takes a lot of time and resource, which is one of the reasons we've got our OD program, because more of us, more people, professionals need to be doing more OD to enable this diagnosis to take place before we jump to any conclusions. And the biggest kind of pause question we need to consider is obviously when somebody comes to us as people professionals, I want to change X, Y, and Z. The first question we should be asking is, how do you know? Okay, and that's the big thing we've got to get better at, is when we're trying to address culture change, don't jump to assumptions, pause and ask, how do you know? And if you don't know, that's when diagnostics will really come into play.
So is anyone familiar with the McKinsey 7S model around organisational change? So it might be something you've come across before, it might not, and we'll talk you through what it is. We find this really useful when you're ever looking at any kind of culture change, whether it's organisationally or at a team level. It's really helpful to use this as a bit of a diagnostic, really. So you can see that it was actually developed by Robert Waterman and Tom Peters during the 1980s. And it was part of the McKinsey group. So it's become known as the McKinsey 7S model. Now, at the centre, you've got culture or shared values, if you want the S term of that. But actually, around the edges, you've got different elements that make up a culture. And the umbrella over that is what's the why. But the culture is obviously, like we've all said, it's the way we do things around here. It's the informal rules of conduct. What you've got around the outside is really the top three, the strategy, structure, and system, tend to be the hard S's. So these are the things that you can see that are really easy to quantify. You know, you've got a strategy in place, which is all about what the company's trying to do, your vision for the future and how you're going to get there. You've got your structure, which is obviously, particularly in the NHS, it's very hierarchical, isn't it? Usually, you've got that organisational hierarchy. What are those authority relationships like? Who reports to who? And you've got the systems as well. So these are obviously you've got loads of systems, your IT systems and all of that kind of thing, but you've also got what are some of the processes that exist, what are some of those daily activities and procedures that happen that make up how our system operates. And then you've also got the three softer areas, which is skills, which is very much organisationally, what are we skilled at, what are our strengths around that, but also individually, what are the skills that make up our organisation. You've got your staff, so what are the intrinsic talents of the people within the organisation and the diversity of those within the organisation as well, because that's important to avoid groupthink. And then you've got the values. So what are these are shared values, that's where the S comes from. But these are our drivers of behaviour that they need to reinforce what the organisation's trying to achieve. So it can be a really, really helpful model to help us to think about any culture and make sure that we've sort of touched all parts of the model, really. And if you think about change, people tend to take the path of least resistance, don't they? You know, on the screen is known as the desire path. So in the world of design and architecture, it simply means that whatever you design, people typically go their own way, taking the path of least resistance. So it might look nice, but actually there's a quicker way through that area there. And just for yourselves, you don't have to put this in chat, but can you think of a change in your organisation where it's not quite gone as planned? And I'll give you an example. So there is an acute trust that I used to work for, and they introduced a new patient reporting system. And it was quite a big change. We had something previously. The bed managers at the hospital tended to use a paper-based system, but we're all going down this electronic route. And they did all the right things on paper. So if you're coming back to the 7S model, the system was absolutely brilliant. It was going to achieve a lot. It was actually, you know, one of the best things that was available out there. It was fast. It should have been easy to use. People were bought into it in terms of the structure. So, you know, in terms of your hierarchical structure, the key players were brought into it. There was a clear strategy about what it was going to do. They thought about actually when we launch this, we'll have some floor walkers. There'll be people that are supporting staff on the ground to use the computer and use the new system. They've thought about the skills to an extent because they thought actually what we need to do is make sure people are trained to use it. So there was some training in place, but what they hadn't considered was values and behaviours and how people operate, and actually that behaviour change from writing stuff on paper or using an older system to using that new one was needed a lot more lead-in time than what they actually gave it. And the way they implemented it, it didn't go to plan. People were using it, but not to an extent that they should have been. There was quite a lot of resistance around it as well. So they ended up having to make the decision to go back to what they'd used previously, because they hadn't landed it in the right way. So despite all of the hard stuff being in place and some of the soft stuff to an extent, they hadn't considered that behaviour change. And thinking about that diffusion model, actually, there were quite a lot of laggards, probably higher on the bell curve than they were in other areas. So when you're thinking about any sort of change, it's really important to look at that model and think about what's going to help. And if you think about when I asked you before, if you thought about a change failure, perhaps that's something that hasn't gone to plan, just reflect back on it. You don't have to do this now because we won't have time, but just reflect back on that 7S model and think about actually what was missing from that. And there are actually 6 core principles that will help you think through organisational change. So it's linked to the 7S model. And the first one is really around identifying the DNA. So what are the key principles? What do you want the vision to look like? And this is very much about that strategy S as well. What you then need to consider is being prepared for people to let go of the past. So the second one on there is very much around staff. And again, thinking about that example I've just given you, there was no opportunity for people to let go of the past, because actually they were just, one day they were using one system, the next day this new one started. There wasn't that almost that mourning period to go, well, that's worked for us in the past. And possibly the why message wasn't right as well. Well, we've got a system that works. Why do we need this one? So if you, again, come back to that why message with any kind of change is so important. And then focus on the circles of control and influence. So this is around the systems. What's within your gift to control and influence around culture change, but what's within other people's gift as well. It doesn't have to be massive. Developing that capability for change. Sometimes people just struggle in terms of actually having the adaptability. Some people love change and thrive on it, don't they? Other people, it takes a while to do that. So how do you give people the skills to enable them to change? And then also thinking about style, so promoting personal and team accountability. How, again, doesn't all have to come to you as the people professional team. How are you giving that accountability to other people? And then finally, just let the change fit the organisation. So this links very much into the structure. So how do we don't want to implement something that doesn't fit with the structure because it's not going to land. And obviously, I mean, there's only one Cornetto, isn't there, as the saying goes, but there's more than one diagnostic model. So there's lots of other ones you can use. And there's a couple on here that we'll show you. I won't go into them because there's some other things that we want to get through. But there's a Wiseboard 6-box model, which very much focuses, as it says on the tin, focuses on 6 different things. So if the 7S model is great, it's something that we found really easy to use when you're thinking about culture change. But we just wanted to share a couple of others because it doesn't work for everybody and you might have a preferred way of doing something. So the 6-box model just focuses on, you know, what's the purpose, the structure, how we're rewarding people, what are relationships like, how do we manage conflict, what are some of the mechanisms, and that's all tied together with who's keeping those boxes held together, so who's the leadership within that. And then the Burke and Litwin model is very much around, actually there's lots of interdependencies when you're thinking about culture. So they various drivers for change, and they almost rank them in terms of importance. The most importance is at the top, and the lower layers gradually become less important. So it argues that all the factors are integrated, and therefore a change in one area will eventually affect all the other factors as well. And they believe that environmental factors are the most important driver for change. And you see that play out in the NHS with all the changes that you experience. But the important elements are mission and strategy, leadership and culture, and they're often impacted by change that originate from outside of the organisation. So just a couple of other models to think about, really.
So don't worry if you're feeling like, oh my goodness, where do I start? If you're feeling overwhelmed, because actually Sarah and I often had, you know, our heads on the steering wheel outside work, just trying to make sense of the fact that we were accountable for organisational culture in a huge organisation. If you're feeling quite overwhelmed, don't worry, just breathe. It doesn't really matter which model you choose. The diagnostics are the most important thing, as well as the why. And if you can't, or you don't want to start big, you know, Sarah said earlier around the best way to sell something is to show it works somewhere else. So when you're identifying those early adopters and trying to identify great practice, really think about where is it already this going on to some extent. Let's look at that and focus on that, and then we can sell that to other people in the organization, because no doubt if the why's right, they will want what this other team have. So don't worry if you're, you know, if you're trying to approach it from too big a perspective, it can blow your mind. So the big thing, and we love this analogy, because has anyone tried to walk the wrong way around IKEA before? And if you have, I do it on purpose, just because that's the sort of person I am. I go, oh no, I need to go back and get my plant pot, sorry. And you know, and everybody's tutting and huffing and everyone's inconvenienced. And obviously, you know, if you're doing that on a busy day, it's even worse. And getting people on board with organizational change and new ways of doing things can feel a little bit like walking the wrong way around IKEA on a busy day. So don't be put off by that. Tap into some perseverance that's deep down and just think, just keep going. Okay, so let's recap on what we've covered then. So we have, you know, this is about starting somewhere, isn't it? Just start somewhere. If you think about the why, no one will change unless they can visualize what that's going to give them. What's in it for me? What's the future look like if I change? So you must get the visualization right and be really clear on your why. Secondly, identify and recruit early adopters. You want to create a movement, and they will help you sell the idea to other people. So culture champions are a great idea as long as you engage them regularly. And don't just assume that they're off out selling the culture. So obviously that's something that you need to bear in mind as well, is that if you're going to have culture champions, make sure there's a real development program, support program behind them. And then thirdly, thinking about the diagnostics. Understand what's driving behaviour. Don't assume just because someone's identified team building as a requirement doesn't mean it's going to have a great impact on culture. And just to get you started, there's some questions that we can share with you that will just help with that initial scoping, with that diagnostic. So you've got, if you think about these three areas, think about the change. How do we know something needs to change? Where's the evidence? Who needs to be involved in this? Quite often HR and OD get pulled in like saviours of the day to go sort something out, when really the accountability sits with managers within the teams or within the departments or directorates. So actually, who are the stakeholders? How can we test it, and how is it going to work? What outcomes are we hoping to see? So some great questions around understanding what good looks like, and what, you know, how do we get there? And very importantly, how we evaluate, how we're going to measure success, what we're going to see, feel and hear that lets us know that this has worked. So some great questions there, just to have in your back pocket, really, to pause and ask before you jump to any assumptions.
And just really coming back before we finish to thinking about the CQC element of well-led. I mean, obviously one of the questions they're asking is very much around, is there a culture of high quality, sustainable care? And for you to answer that question, there's lots of things you can do to get data, and actually we'll talk about some of this if you come into the second webinar. But some great questions to ask when you're thinking about that overall culture. Do staff feel supported? Do they feel respected and valued? You know, how meaningful are your one-to-ones and appraisals? You'll get lots of this from your staff survey data. How are people communicated with? What are some of those levels of psychological safety? And you can use the 7S model to diagnose this as well. But go out and look at your organisation, look at what's happening, what you're hearing. If you go back to the original visualisation that we asked you to think about, how far away is where you're currently at in terms of your culture compared to what you want that vision to be. And you can do that through just observing and thinking about these questions. So those three around overall culture. Also, a key one to think about is psychological safety. So is behaviour and performance that isn't consistent with the vision and values addressed, regardless of seniority? And this can sometimes be frustrating. Again, just to give you another example, I worked at a trust years ago now, but one of the things, rightly or wrongly, that they had to do to get the pay progression was make sure the mandatory training was up to date. And unfortunately for me, it's the HR team would send out a letter if they weren't compliant, and they wouldn't be getting the pay progression point. Any sort of appeals will come to me for my team to deal with. And do you know what? Like, if anyone's done MBTI, I'm an F, so I like that harmony. I like people to be happy at work, and I really struggled with making those impartial decisions when you had, for example, a Band 2 cleaner who wasn't getting a pay progression, who accepted that and thought, yeah, no, you're right, I should have done it, compared to a senior leader who was in an 8B role at the time that really didn't agree with the fact that he hadn't done his mandatory training, and tried quite hard to get around that by getting a director involved, and it didn't feel right to me. And that just gives you an example really of how behaviour and performance that isn't consistent with the vision values is addressed regardless of seniority. So just because someone's in a senior role, there should still be that psychological safety to address that issue or speak to that person. And does the culture encourage openness and honesty in response to incidents? So some things to think about there. Do people feel able to raise concerns, for example? And the third one then is about thriving individuals. So do staff at every level have the development they need? And do they have high quality career development conversations? Is there a strong emphasis on safety and well-being? What about equality and diversity and inclusion? Is that promoted in and beyond the organisation as well? And then finally, thinking about thriving teams. So how are people treated? Is it equitable? Are there cooperative, supportive and appreciative relationships among staff? What about collaboration, and how's conflict resolved? Is it resolved in a really constructive way? So as I said, with these questions, it's just worth going out. Some of it you'll get from different data sources, but actually it's very much around just going out and seeing what's happening. And don't let it be a surprise. Like we said at the beginning, you know, we've worked in organisations where it's almost like, oh no, CQC are coming in. Why is it a surprise? We should be working in that way anyway. And you can be really ahead of the game when it comes to culture, and using this as an opportunity, as a gift almost, to root out any issues and capitalise on those positive opportunities to be on the front door, really. And it links back nicely to our diagnostic model, and we can start to explore why that might be the case, and how you source the information to explore the diagnostic process. We'll cover in our webinar on the 22nd of March, so hopefully you'll be there. It's not to be missed. We'll give you lots more practical information that will help continue your diagnostic journey, and then start to look towards solutions that are actually going to hit the mark and make a difference in a small way. It's just changing the culture one conversation at a time, really. So we'd love to hear how you're getting on. So please do get in touch with us. You've got our email address there. If you've got any questions, obviously you can pop them in chat. We have got a couple of minutes, so feel free to do that. But we'd love to hear how you're getting on, or if you've just got anything that you want to talk to us about culture related separately, please do get in touch. And if you come into our next one on the 22nd, we look forward to seeing you there. And I don't know how many we've got booked. Is that fully booked, Joe? Or are there any spaces left on that one?
No, I was going to say that at the end. You know, if you've enjoyed today's session, then we do have spaces available on the event on the 22nd, and then the final event of this series on the 30th of March. Please do go to the website and register this morning before they do fill up and we have to close it. But yeah, we've still got room, so please do it. Thank you, Sarah. And
Brilliant, thank you.
Nicola. Been a great session. I hope everybody's really enjoyed this morning. They've got some really good, helpful, practical tips and ideas that you can take back into your organisation. So yeah, please do register for the remaining 2 events and the other events that we've got available as well. There's lots available at the moment. Thank you for taking the time this morning to join us, because I know you're all extremely busy. If you've got colleagues that weren't able to make it, this will be available on the hub. If you just allow us a few days to get it on the hub, it will be on the hub. So thank you very much. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hope you found it useful. We do cram quite a lot in, so we try to give you lots of practical things to take away.